I think what makes our church special is just how the preaching is totally unfiltered. I don't have any advice for homosexuals except to put a bullet in your own head so that you don't molest my kids or anyone else's kids. Uncensored, just raw Bible preaching.
Why is it that the church obsesses itself more with people's individual sexualities than any other cultural problem in the world today? For the last 2,000 years, Christianity has been an advocate for family values and conservative ideology. Except that's not true, and the church has always flip-flopped on ideas about everything from the Earth's position within the solar system to whether or not it's totally cool to just murder Muslim people when they get too close to a city that you don't live in. Okay, well, actually the problem of Christians killing Muslim people for the sake of land is still a problem, and we should probably talk about it at some point, but that's not what this video is about today. So the point is that many Christians have this view of their religion as this eternal and unchanging ideology that's only recently begun to receive pushback. Because in reality, where the world exists, that's not actually the case. Christianity has always had to find ways to exist along the current cultural mainstream in order to survive and continue working for the purpose of spreading its message. And although this process has never gone totally smoothly, the result has been largely that the church has been dragged kicking and screaming along with many cultural ideologies, even if it has occasionally had to backtrack and apologize for the time it's taken to sort itself out and join the correct side. So then, today, when I, a nerd in all things theology and church history, see a church that's divided and prepared to go to war over the issue of whether or not two adult men can touch each other in very specific locations on their bodies, I start to think of the past.
What's happening across the denomination that is contrary to what we see as solid biblical teaching?
One of those beliefs having to do with LGBT issues.
A part of this discussion is homosexual marriage. And there are many who want to celebrate homosexual marriage within our churches and that pastors will officiate in those services. But for those of us for whom we see that is not a marriage that is blessed by God, we're not going to do that.
While it's easy to think of homosexuality as the newest threat against Christian conservative culture, you do have to remember that homosexual activity and behavior have existed for a lot longer than you probably think. The first ever historical record of a homosexual relationship of any kind is dated back to 2,000 years before Jesus existed. In ancient Egypt, artistic drawings and paintings exist that depict men in extremely intimate poses together, these poses only typically being reserved for those in married relationships or who are in love. In fact, what we would now consider to be homosexual couples or people engaging in homosexual behavior have existed in many cultures for thousands of years prior to Jesus. The mere existence of these people help us understand major factors around biblical texts surrounding Jesus and the ministry of Jesus. Jesus knew homosexual people existed. Yet, amongst all the many different sins that Jesus speaks on, same-sex intercourse is never mentioned by him or any of the disciples surrounding him in any version of our biblical text. This helps us dispel a common myth in some of Christianity, that Jesus does not speak on non-conforming gendered individuals or same-sex relationships because they did not exist in any sort of proliferation. In fact, one could argue quite the opposite. In many ways, the view of sexual activity between like-gendered people was more common in the lives of Greek and Roman citizens than it is today amongst American culture. But we'll talk about that more in just a moment. Why is it that the only attitude on sexual activity that we see Jesus take is one of grace and understanding when the modern church reacts so aggressively towards it? Even in clear-cut instances of dealings with people who have committed sexual sins like infidelity or premarital sex, Jesus seems to focus more on the attitudes of these people and the healing of them in the eyes of the community than any kind of outcrying of their activities.
Master, what shall we do? This woman has been caught in the act of adultery. She should be punished according to the law. What do you say?
Answer, Master. We want to know your opinion.
Yes, tell us. Is it right to kill her?
He among you who is without sin, let him cast the first stone.
Could it be, perhaps, that Jesus thought that same-sex interaction was not nearly the issue that the church considers it now centuries later? And if that's the case, what other factors could be contributing to the modern church's attitude on the subject. If we move forwards in time just a little bit, one of the major voices cited in the current church's views on homosexuality is the Apostle Paul. Paul has written a lot of the New Testament in the form of letters sent out to various churches of the known world, helping them understand their problems in ministry and by extension helping us understand our own problems in our current contexts. Paul has been attributed as an author of multiple instances of scriptures that historically have been used to condemn homosexual activity. For instance, in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, it's often interpreted that Paul states a decrying of men who defile themselves with mankind, as Paul decrying homosexuality. However, most modern translations do not write the phrasing of this passage to use only male-on-male normative language. A much better interpretation of the Greek is to say that Paul is against men who engage in sexually illicit intercourse. And the meaning of that is pretty vague. And the reason for this is because Paul probably isn't making a statement on homosexuality here, rather opting to warn against engagement with prostitution or maybe even pedophilia. Further, the vast majority of scholars do not even believe that Paul wrote this letter to Timothy that's made it into our Bible, and thus it may be considered irrelevant by some anyhow. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, Paul writes a letter to the church of Corinth on a great number of disagreements in the church. In this verse in particular, verses 9 and 10, Paul writes against fornicators, idolaters, thieves, the greedy, and the men who abuse themselves with mankind. In any case, though, the context of Paul's writing here is specifically to instruct church members not to try and sue one another in the pagan-run courts of the Greek court system. This passage actually has very little to do with homosexuality. It's just been clung on to by those with a specific agenda against gay people. In any case, the wording here is confusing and not clear at all. While some older translations do seem to indicate a discussion against homosexual activity, again, it's similar to the wording in Timothy, wherein the words used in Greek have multiple meanings. This could be an admonishment against homosexual activity, but it could also be about men who cheat on their wives, or have sex with their relatives, or have sex slaves that participate in pagan sexualistic rituals. While we certainly can't rule out the possibility that Paul might be talking about gay people, we also certainly can't admit that there's a definite answer either. Lastly, in Romans chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, Paul talks about those that exist outside of God's love and have committed sins because of God's discipline. Specifically, the wordage here states that women give up natural sexual relations for unnatural ones, and likewise, men give up natural relations with women for passionate desires for one another, and that males commit shameless acts with other males. So, okay, now we've got them, right? Paul here is more specifically speaking on the relationships that Roman citizens may be engaging in that allow them to go outside of what God considers natural, which God does find sinful. However, this is the point in which we need to talk about that little thing I mentioned before about how homosexual behavior was in some ways more common in Roman and Greek culture than it is in American culture today. Because while that's true in some ways, it's also untrue in other ways.
To be able to stand at an altar and have the union blessed, that was a very emotional and spiritual piece for me.
Both of our parents were married all their lives, and I think we both grew up thinking marriage was a lifetime commitment to each other.
It's also not having to always be right in any relationship. You could see that's an issue.
If you were to describe to me a homosexual couple, how would you describe them? If you were predictable, you might describe them as people with dyed hair and a bunch of rainbow-colored clothing. But for the most part, if you ever actually met a gay person, you'd probably describe them as just regular people that happen to be of the same gender and also happen to be attracted to one another and living in some kind of relationship with one another. You might even think about a wedding with two grooms or two brides. And while there are cases of these people dressing or appearing in slightly less gender-conforming clothing or styles, for the most part, you'd have to admit you don't have a great way of knowing that someone is gay just by looking at them. This is because despite the fact that gay people are painted by right-leaning politicians as quote-unquote unnatural, their actions are still largely normative. They may exist in a way that our society seems as irregular, but they actually do hold up to regular relationship behavior. It just so happens that the genders match rather than oppose. In ancient civilizations, this was less likely the case. Most examples of homosexual activity in the Roman world was not between married couples with two adopted kids. It was often far different. While it's true that men sleeping together and women sleeping together was more normative, the reasons why they did so were completely and objectively different. Men who engaged in sex with other men was done as a show of force, where the submissive partner was ostracized and insulted by the aggressive nature of the dominant partner. Women engaging in sexual behavior with each other was often done in ways to worship gods of fertility and outside the confines of their marriage, if they were married at all. In almost every case, these homosexual activities were happening outside the confines of any kind of real relationship, and instead happening in brothels, or instances of abuse, or ways in which most would deem outside the confines of a family-oriented relationship. Conversations around these types of activities would take on an entirely different light if we switched up the wording of some of these verses to understand the more common ways in which homosexuality took place amongst these groups of people. In truth, while Paul may have had an opinion on the problems of homosexual behavior, the reality of what he knew to be homosexual behavior was entirely different than what it is today. Sex between one man and one woman within the confines of marriage isn't all that different from sex between two married men or two married women. However, sex that happens between two men that are cheating on their spouses, or groups of men and women who are engaging in power plays, or abusing others, or holding sex slaves hostage, or maybe even having sex in some sort of worship of other pagan gods, are entirely different in context and scope than the monogamous couple that lives next door to you. In all of these cases, we see that Paul's writings are outside of a clear-cut and black and white disavowalment of the LGBTQ community that we know today. Instead, a much longer conversation is needed, with many more caveats than we typically hear from each side of the discussion. While it's true that Scripture does contain some verses on how we should be cautious about certain types of sexual activity, it's definitely not clear that every type of sexual activity between two men or two women are to be deemed as outright immoral. And by the way, you may have noted that we haven't really mentioned the dreaded trans word, nor have we addressed the idea of gender in Scripture as a whole. And that's because those ideas in Scripture really don't exist in any applicable way. While Old Testament theology, like the creation narrative, describes the creation of male and female as being distinctly different, and only ever describes male and female roles as a binary distinction, how else would the ancient people describe a male and female pair? Especially when one of the primary narratives of Old Testament theology revolve around a couple's ability to conceive children and pass on inheritance. Obviously, in this instance, under these theologies, a male and female dichotomy are going to be emphasized.
A lot of people say it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. I say to myself, I kind of wish it was Steve, because I bet he wouldn't have been so dumb to talk to a snake. Am I right, dudes? Where my dudes at? Where my dudes at tonight? Women are dumb. Come on now. It's right there in the Bible.
But the creation narrative is not an encyclopedia of all things created in the universe. In fact, in the creation story, we don't really read about any kind of specific animal. We just hear about categories. And if we really need to go all the way back to Genesis to teach what God did or did not create when it comes to specific species or specific genomes, then we are playing a losing game. So the omission of one specific non-gendered or transgendered people is not really a surprise. Further, the existence of those that are working outside the normal gender binary does not invalidate the existence of those who are existing within it. Just because people exist that are not gendered or transgendered and therefore cannot or will not reproduce biological offspring, that doesn't invalidate the Old Testament theology surrounding God's provision of people who will create offspring and who will have children. The same could also be said for homosexual couples.
Because you just say, I'm saved. So whatever you do, when you beat your wife, when you beat your kids, when you do what you want in sin, it's okay because you're already saved. That's why you're just a cop-out.
You know what? It's a sin not to beat your kids. It's a sin not to beat your kids. The Bible says, thou shalt beat.
Jesus Christ.
Lastly, it's asinine to think that we must completely submit to an ancient understanding of gender and gender roles and sexuality just because our religious foundation comes from that time period. There are an absolute shit ton of things that culturally no longer align with how we operate in our modern society. Paul's lack of understanding of a committed homosexual marriage, or the lack of non-gender conforming people in the Old Testament, should come as no surprise. No one that existed in the world 5,000 years ago would have had an understanding of any type of gender-specific psychology, so there's no reason to take their opinions on gender roles all that seriously. Oh, what's that? You want to take the advice of the guys that thought it was totally cool to own women and reproduce with concubines and thought that marital rape was just a healthy sexual relationship? You think that they have the best philosophies on gender roles in our current culture? No, of course not. The Bible exists within its own cultural framework, and we need to understand that framework in order to correctly identify what parts of Scripture are useful to us and what parts are less than applicable when we get into the logistics. The church over the last 1800 years or so, since Scripture was made canonical and solidified, has been quietly ignoring the homosexual issue. While other cultures had examples of homosexual activities, as we already spoke about earlier, the church didn't really know how to fit those relationship types into their understanding of Scripture or theology. But the outright ostracization of homosexuals and non-gender conforming individuals is more and more a recent implementation. It did exist before, but it was more likely to be covered up rather than openly pushed back on. For instance, did you know that the Catholic Church has gay saints? Sergius and Bacchus, two Roman soldiers that convert together, end up dying for their beliefs, and they have a deep relationship that is described using words that are used in Latin to also describe romantic relationships. While some scholars refrain from calling them a homosexual couple, it's highly debatable. And the lack of anti-homosexual ideology in the framework of the church makes sense, especially when you remember that the church pretty much only cares about one real cultural problem at a time. And for much of the history of the church, for the last couple thousand years, it has been more concerned with other types of conflict. It could be the Crusades, or the Reformation, or maybe the Great Schism of the church. But all of these other developments in the church were much more and bigger existential threats than gay people could ever be. So the conceptualization of the LGBTQ community as the antithesis of all things Christianity is not something grounded in Scripture, it's not traditionally a major issue, and it's culturally much more complex than we typically hear the average evangelical pastor preach against. But why is it then that we see this culture war style discussion on LGBTQ issues today?
Signed a petition at change.org calling for the cancellation of the popular TLC reality show 19 Kids and Counting. Critics say the family's recent anti-LGBT statements have gone just too far.
The Fayetteville City Council is voting on an ordinance this Tuesday night that would allow men, yes, I said men, to use women's and girls' restrooms, locker rooms, showers, sleeping areas, and other areas that are designated for females only. I don't believe the citizens of Fayetteville would want males with past child predator convictions that claim they are female to have a legal right to enter private areas reserved for women and girls. We should never place the preference of an adult over the safety and innocence of a child. Parents, who do you want undressing next to your daughter at the public swimming pool's private changing area?
The answer lies with Christian fundamentalism. Christian fundamentalism is an understanding of our faith that seeks to elevate their specific understanding of a literal view of Scripture over and above any other cultural or societal idea or philosophy. In some ways, you might say that as a Christian that bases their view on Scripture, that the elevation of Scripture is a good thing, and it's foundational to how we think about our faith. But fundamentalists are not just elevating Scripture. They are elevating their own view of Scripture over every other thing within Christianity, even when it means that Jesus himself gets overwritten by other places in Scripture that more directly communicate a conservative-leaning principle or that aligns with a fundamentalist view or political cultural reality. Christian fundamentalism is what's given us such cultural bangers as the Duggar family, purity culture, and also the anti-civil rights movement. People within this culture will often say that anything outside of a literal reading of every single scripture in the Bible is unbiblical, even when that reading is scholarly examination of scripture that seeks to understand and interpret the Bible within its accurate historical context.
He's drunk as a badger. Go ahead. Let that Holy Ghost language come up out of you. Go ahead.
But the thing is that there is no such thing in this modern day and age as someone that never contextualizes Scripture. We do not stone people, we do cut our hair, and we certainly wear clothes made out of multiple pieces of fabric. No one that aspires to be fully quote-unquote Bible-based or scriptural literalists are actually either of those things. Everyone views Scripture through a context. They just don't agree with the contexts of others because they're theologically illiterate.
But you know that you've got into a lot of hot water over comments you've made. For example, about homosexuality, right? Which you believe is a sin, right?
Well, it's what God says.
What do you believe?
Well, that's what the Bible teaches.
Well, the Bible says all sorts of things which we don't do now.
No, I believe the Bible from cover to cover, Piers. I don't understand it all, but I believe it.
The Bible has stuff in it which would be absurd today.
No, I'm sorry. I believe the Bible to be the Word of God.
So we should still be stoning people in the street?
I'm saying I believe the Bible cover to cover. And in the Old Testament...
Well, so I just said, in there, they talk about stoning people to death in the street. Would you do that?
In the Old Testament, they did.
As we hear more about Pride Month and the cultural discussion around the LGBTQ community heats up, some people in the church are going to become more outspokenly hateful towards people that do not look or act like them, and we should be careful to all remember that there are reasons that people might think differently than us. In fact, there are Christians that might think differently than us. There are lesbian and gay and bisexual and trans and queer people that have been abused by the church, and therefore they no longer have a faith to lean on. That's a real shame, and there is space for all of us under the umbrella of Christianity. There are no people in the church without sin, and even if you are the most staunch defender of the gender binary, surely you can at least accept the fact that LGBTQ people and communities can try to live out their faith in the best way that they can, just like you and me. I have a duty as a pastor and a person with Christian beliefs to love all people. While I may be harsh on those I disagree with, and I may use this platform to lambast those idiotic evangelicals that dare to use the name of God to spread hate and disgusting opinions, I ultimately do so in order to shine a light on the shortcomings that will hopefully bring some deceived by those beliefs out of them. I also want to promote a place that seeks to counter the conservative narrative that drives people away with one that is far more accepting and, in my opinion, far more biblical. I believe that LGBTQ people belong in the church just as much as they belong anywhere else. That is to say, that they belong fully and should be available to serve and participate in every way that they want to. If a person comes up to me and tells me that they are a Christian and they want to participate in my church, I don't ask them what their genitalia looks like, nor who their partner is, or what their sex life looks like, or even what their political beliefs are. I only ask them how I can help. I believe that's what Jesus would do, and that's what I've decided I'd like to do also. Happy Pride Month, everybody. Thanks for watching, subscribe for more, and I love you all.